So yeah, as Fraser very kindly introduced me, my name's Ashley Moore. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia. So UBC is situated on the traditional, ancestral and unceded lands of the Musqueam people. But today, working from my flat in the West End of Vancouver, I acknowledge that I'm also occupying the lands of the Coast Salish, the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, Stolo and Stuminus First Nations. As you might still be able to tell from my accent, although it's drifting out into the mid-Atlantic somewhere, I'm actually from the Midlands. I know there's a lot of people from the Midlands here. So I was born and raised in Staffordshire. So it's nice to, I wish I could hear your accents and sound like home. And the question I'd like to explore today is, can the language classroom be queered? And I'd like to thank Jay, Fraser, and the members of the Language, Gender and Sexuality SIG for creating this amazing platform for early career researchers like myself to share our work. I'll be honest, I didn't sleep well last night because I was quite excited about this, so it's a real pleasure to be here. And as we know, it's LGBTQ plus History Month, so I'll start by sharing an extremely brief history of those issues in language education. And then I'll explain how I'm theorizing the language classroom so that it can be seen as an institutional context, before using that framework to explore what the literature, including my own work, tells us about gender and sexuality in the language classroom. Lastly, I thought I'd use this opportunity to not only share my work today, but also as an opportunity for myself to take stock and re-strategize my work going forward. Okay, so that promised extremely brief history of LGBTQ issues in language education. And by the way, you can find all the references to the works I mentioned during the talk in the downloadable handout available through the link I shared in the chat. So the first recorded queer stirrings in the field of language education can be traced back to the 1980s, and it crept onto the margins of the field through association newsletters or as mentions in larger discussions, such as Little John and Windeyett's mention of heterosexism in a long list of isms that might pervade language teaching materials. That was in 1989. Then in the 1990s, largely spearheaded, I think, by one of my academic heroes, Cynthia Nelson, queer issues were pushed onto the main stage with pieces like this, Nelson's 1993 forum piece in TESOL Quarterly that discussed 7 common heterosexist attitudes encountered by Nelson and her colleagues as they tried to claim a space for us in the field. And then in the last 2 decades, the literature on queer issues in language education has finally snowballed. And we can find groundbreaking work based on queer perspectives across the leading publishers and journals and on the biggest conference stages. But before I explore what the body of work tells us about the gender and sexuality of the classroom, I'll briefly discuss the theoretical framework that helps me to understand how the language classroom comes to be as an institutional social setting. As many of you know, or as many of you will be familiar with Derek Lader's theory of social domains. And as many of you know, Lader argues that events in the social world are the emergent products of 4 always present domains that shape but don't completely determine what actually happens. At the more micro end of the social world, this includes the psychobiography of individuals, which can refer to the enduring psychological dispositions, memories, and so on of the individuals in a language class, in my case, while the more fleeting domain of situated activity accounts for what unfolds between particular social actors during relatively short-lived events. The situated activity of language learning often takes place within the social setting of the classroom, which refers to both the material reality of the space itself, but also the enduring, reproduced roles, practices, and artifacts of the language classroom that we expect to find and orient to when we enter a social setting that we understand to be a language classroom. At the most macro end of the social world, we have contextual resources, and there's two kinds of these. There's the material resources, money and goods, for example, that are spread unevenly over social space, but also cultural resources, such as fashions, ideologies, educational policies, laws, and so on. So when thinking about the question of how are gender and sexuality typically constructed in the language classroom, it can help us to think about the enduring roles and artifacts that constitute the language classroom and the practices that emerge from and recursively shape them. Okay, let's start with the role of the teacher. When we think about that role, it's obviously one that holds a lot of institutionally granted power. Teachers design lessons based on the perceived needs of their students, and they act as the gatekeeper and guide for a lot of L2 knowledge, which they select and explain. They set learning tests, ask questions, and give feedback on students' use of the target language. However, not every teacher is convinced that queer lives are relevant in the language classroom. Gay students, I've never had a student come out to me. Besides, is it really our job to help them with their social lives? So this was one of the heterosexist attitudes discussed by Nelson way back in 1993. And I can tell you that I still sometimes encounter this resistance to the incorporation of queer issues in language education today. And the answer is yes, it is a fundamental job of the language teacher to help our students participate in the social world of the target L2. And every social world throughout history, as you know, has contained queer people. Everybody, not just queer students, need to develop the relevant socio-sexual literacies, as Nelson calls them, to talk about queerness in respectful ways. But that might not be happening, as evidence suggests that gender and sexuality are still being left off the curriculum in many language teacher training programs, as Pace showed. And this is further demonstrated when we look at training materials likely to be used on such programs, such as this one. This is the Teacher's Handbook of Contextualized Language Instruction. It's in its 5th edition. This was published in 2015. And they have a whole chapter on addressing the needs of diverse learners in the language classroom. Not once does it mention anything about queer sexuality or gender, despite a massive 2 decades worth of really even longer literature that shows us the relevance of those lives. And Liddicott's landmark study got into classrooms and showed how attempts by learners to index queer identities in the L2 were often reframed by language teachers as linguistic errors. In my recent study that explored the learning experiences of 16 queer learners of Japanese as a second and foreign language, there were bright signs that if and when they had chosen to index their queerness, their instructors reacted positively to this. But the participants longed for proactive, inclusive praxis, an inclusion statement at the beginning of a course, the sustained integration of queer perspectives in the materials, and so on. Of course, queer people don't owe anyone that information. We reserve the right to resist confessions under the normative gaze. But some teachers themselves are queer and would like to share aspects of their lives that intertwine with that queerness. And to be sure, some do. But the literature also tells us that the role of a teacher comes with strings attached that make this process fraught. Teachers like Helen in Cynthia's landmark book, Sexual Identities in Language Education, fear that effect that it will have on the evaluations they get from students with a track record of homophobia. Teachers like Jackson in Leal and Crook's recent study fear the effect it will have on their tenure and promotion prospects. And teachers like Dale, a young English teacher embedded in a small town in Japan, who I interviewed as part of the aforementioned project, worried about the renewal of his contract if his sexual identity started circulating among the hidden networks of the town. Turning to those occupying the role of the student in language classrooms, this is a position that forms a relational pair with the role of the teacher and has notably less power in traditional educational models. In the neoliberal knowledge economy, students are often trying to produce legitimized knowledge in exchange for grades, in the hope that this cultural capital will be exchanged for economic capital in the future. Thinking more optimistically, we also undertake language learning to learn about new social worlds, participate in them, and perhaps even transform ourselves. We complete learning tests, respond to L2 texts, and interact in the target language. Studies suggest that some of that interaction may also contribute to the dominance of normative gender and sexuality in language classrooms. These studies include Nguyen and Lang's study of classroom discourse featuring a non-binary, actually trans-gendered student, Han, and how other students sometimes resisted her non-normative gender identities. And also Rhodes' reflection on the strategy she used when faced with a student who was vocally homophobic in class. In a study in which I examined the classroom experiences of the students of a queer English class organized by a Japanese non-political organization, it was notable for me that one of them, Junya, described his commercial English conversation schools that he had studied in as those heterosexual conversation schools. And in my most recent paper, in Press Now with the Journal of Language and Identity in Education, I show how some students enter the social setting of their language classrooms already understanding that gender and sexuality, or rather, as I argue, non-normative gender and sexualities, have no place within that space. As Marie, a cisgender bisexual student of Japanese, answered when I asked her if queer-related topics had ever come up in the language classes she had taken. You know, if I'm sitting in a biology classroom, I'm not going to start talking about my gender identity. And in Japanese, it was kind of the same way. Theodora, who identified as both genderqueer and pansexual, is the other focal participant in the article, also approached language classrooms, assuming that there would be a lack of connection between the content of the class and their queer identities. However, given the right conditions, Theodora was able to openly question the heteronormative assumptions underpinning one of the texts they discussed in class. Those enabling conditions included the Japanese socio-cultural milieu, which they found more progressive in terms of queerness than what they had experienced in their native Romania, and a Japanese reading teacher who gave Theodora plenty of evidence that she was a likely ally. Theodora's queering of a normative text brings us to the common artifacts we find within the social setting of the language classroom, textbooks and so-called authentic texts. Various studies continue to show that the vast majority of commercially and even locally produced language materials continue to perpetuate heterosexism and cisgenderism through the systematic erasure of queer lives, much like Lotte discussed in her presentation. At the same time, there have been some promising developments spearheaded by small teams and individual teachers, such as the Lesson on Families designed by Catherine Billsborough for the British Council, which incorporates representations of queer families appropriate for young learners, and a series of textbooks developed by the Raise Up project team, published by an independent publisher, TaylorMade English. If we can't see any change in terms of the materials published by mainstream publishers, perhaps authentic texts are the way to go. However, as the excellent Netflix documentary on trans representation in TV and film, Disclosure, makes clear, not all representations are created with equity, inclusion, and empowerment in mind. With this complexity in mind, I created a taxonomy of representational heteronormativity that can be used as a guide for both identifying different forms of heteronormativity and guiding our decisions as we make or select better representations to bring into the classroom. But despite all the considerable progress we've made, I still see a gap between the theories of better practice we can find in the literature and the classroom realities faced by many teachers and learners. So now I conclude by considering the mechanisms likely to be holding us back. And for me, I can narrow these down to three. The fact that many of our ideas remain inaccessible in form and style. A lack of inspiring examples of what's possible. And the fact that cis and heteronormativity remain intractable in mainstream language education. I've also come up with some strategies through making this presentation that hopefully will counteract some of these mechanisms. The first strategy is to make our work on queer inclusion in language education more accessible and forwardable. By accessible, I mean both in terms of where we disseminate it and the way we communicate it. So it's not just open access, but also thinking about the way we can package it so it's accessible to busy language teachers. Actually, preparing for this talk has helped to kickstart some new approaches for me. So in early January, I made a YouTube video explaining my taxonomy, which until then had been locked behind a paywall and some fairly dense academic prose. And taking advantage of the YouTube automated translation, the video can be watched with subtitles in various languages, which if the Japanese subtitles are anything to go by, are fairly accurate. Here you can see the automatically generated subtitles for Turkish. If there's any Turkish speakers in the audience, you can tell me how good those are. The second strategy is to document and share more inspiring examples of what is possible when we try to queer various language classrooms in different contexts. Of course, depending on the effects of the 4 social domains, what's possible will vary considerably, especially when we consider the inhibitive contextual cultural resources operating in some contexts, such as Oklahoma, Saudi Arabia, and China. But without sharing positive models, like Tyson Stevens' mock-up of what queer inclusive teaching materials might look like, many teachers will remain too fearful of what might go wrong to be proactively queer inclusive in their praxis. Finally, my third strategy is to apply more pressure on the mainstream. That means making sure that we review textbooks designed for language learning, or even the textbooks designed to train language teachers, and start asking if queer perspectives are included, and if not, why not? Formulating this strategy actually helped me to think up my next research study, which will be a discursive analysis of if and how human diversity is considered within language teaching training handbooks, like this one, with a special focus on queer diversity. I won't start this until I finish my PhD and hopefully find gainful employment. But if anyone's interested in collaborating on this future project, I hope you'll get in touch. And on that note, I'll finish by sharing my contact info and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ashley. That was another really fascinating and thought-provoking talk. I think thank you particularly for giving us this really valuable opportunity to take stock of what's quite a well-established field now, as you say, but it's really relevant to a lot of members, our members, I think. And again, there's some disappointing findings in there, as we saw with Lotta's talk, but I think you've also given us a lot of cause for optimism as well, and some kind of practical strategies for moving forward. So that's really fantastic to see. Thank you. So as before,